First, tell me your name.
Lahav Harkov.
So we in the U.S. have been calling you Lahav, but you actually pronounce it Lahav. Right?
Yeah, so I grew up in the US and I'm just like very used to being called Lahav, even by people in my family. But the actual correct Hebrew name is Lahav.
Tell me about your background. You were at the Jerusalem Post for a long time.
Yeah, I was at the Jerusalem Post for 13 years. I started my last year of college. Most of that time, I was the Knesset reporter. So I reported on Israel's parliament and Israeli politics, mostly focused on the legislative side of things, but really, in an election, it's all hands on deck. And then for the past few years, I wrote about diplomacy, about Israel's international relations. And now I'm at the Jewish Insider, where I write about both, so domestic politics and international relations.
So there's a lot of interest in mostly Netanyahu in the U.S.
Yeah.
His longevity is in part a result of the system that you have here. Can you just explain for people in the U.S. what the parliamentary system here is like? How does that work?
Yeah, so I find that the best way to explain it is to start with election day. In Israel, on election day, you show up to your polling place, which, like in the US, is like, all kinds of public buildings, public schools mostly in Israel, or public preschools, which we have here. You show your ID, which in Israel is not a controversial thing, and you go behind the screen, and in front of you is a large tray with different sections, and in each section is a little pile of notes that has a letter. The letter represents a party. And you could have as many as 30 different options that you vote for. You pick the little piece of paper that represents the party you want to vote for. So you're voting for a party, not a person. You put that piece of paper in an envelope, you come out, you drop the envelope in a box. In front of there's like a committee of 3 that like supervises, and they're supposed to be people affiliated with 3 different political parties to make sure it's fair. Then the votes are counted. There's a threshold. It's 3.25%. So anybody who doesn't get 3.25% of the vote is not getting into the Knesset. Any party, correct. Every party that gets above 3.25% of the vote, those votes are divided up proportionally between 120 seats in the Knesset. No party has ever gotten a majority. The most was, I think it was 52. It was the Labor Party in the 1970s. Right before it crashed and fell, but the Labor Party was the dominant party from Israel's establishment in 48 until 1977. So there's always been at least 2 parties governing the country because you need to form a coalition in order to get a majority. And these coalitions are often very fractious and they tend not to last for full terms. A full term is until November of the 4th year from the election. It's about 4 years, but it could be closer to 5 years depending on when the election ends up being, which has to do with when the previous coalition fell apart.
This government has been since November of 22, correct? Or they took...
Yeah, I mean, the election was November 22. It took like about 6 weeks for them to actually establish the government and be sworn in. But basically, yeah.
Since the war, what is the structure of it? What has happened since the war with the government?
So there was a 64-seat coalition, which is like a solid coalition because, you need minimum 61. And it was a right-wing and religious coalition. So all the parties were, you start from the moderate right of Likud. Really, Likud is like a variety. Likud is one of the few parties in Israel that actually has a robust primary system. They have over 100,000 members and they vote. So you actually have people in Likud who are more far-right and you have people in Likud who are more like classic liberal right. Either way, Likud's the sort of most moderate party in the coalition, and then you have the far right, and then you have 2 Haredi parties, 2 Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox parties. After the war started, a few weeks later, one of these centrist parties in the Knesset joined the coalition to show sort of unity in wartime. It's also a party led by Benny Gantz and Gadi Eisenkot, who are 2 former chiefs of staff of the IDF, so you could sort of understand that they're people who feel very committed to the safety and well-being of the country. I mean, I think all of the political parties are committed to the well-being of the country, don't get me wrong, but when you're the head of the army, you view things in a certain way, you view your own responsibility in a certain way, and I think that played a big part in why they decided to put politics aside and join in the coalition with Netanyahu. And Netanyahu formed like a smaller war cabinet together with them and a couple of other people from his side, and they're the people who really run the war.
When you say when a coalition falls apart, what does that look like?
It could be over a lot of things. In my almost 15 years of closely following Israeli politics, it actually often has to do with the issue of the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox, and whether they'll serve in the military or not. Not always, but often that's a huge political issue. That's often a huge problem for coalitions because there's repeated Supreme Court orders saying that the situation needs to change. And then when the government's not able to change it, that leads to political turmoil. And it's not able to change it because you have these ultra-Orthodox parties that are very committed to the status quo and they won't agree to anything. It usually means that the prime minister says, we're not managing to get anything done, let's have an election. Usually it's the prime minister ends up calling an election. And then he brings it to a vote in the Knesset and they vote on an election date, which is usually around, the minimum is 90 days from that point. So it's usually 90 days, 100 days, 105 days.
Let me ask two questions. The first is, you said about the Haredi or the Haredim.
Yeah.
The ultra-Orthodox not serving in the army. Let's just say a little bit about that and then I'll ask my second.
So when the State of Israel was established, it was a few years after the Holocaust, and the sort of central institutions of Torah study, certainly in the Western world, had been totally destroyed. The top rabbis and biblical scholars, many of whom were murdered, although their students often pulled together money or got them saved, got them to America, got them to Israel in some cases. But the way the Haredim describe it is that they say like the world of Torah had almost been destroyed. So there were about 7,000 people who wanted to dedicate themselves full-time to Torah study, and David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister, agreed to this and said, okay, these people can have an exemption. And Ben-Gurion was a secular man, but he sort of understood the value of tradition and Jewish history as something that has kept the Jewish people alive and together. And so he agreed to this exemption, even though, Israel was at war when it was first established.
Was that intended to be just for those 7,000 people, or did he say it was for anybody from there?
It was not so clear, because it wasn't precisely codified. And over the years, the numbers grew, in part because the Haredim tend to have more children than the average in Israel. I think in part because it became like a successful system of schools where they were able to give people stipends, and so people didn't necessarily have to go right to work and things like that. And there's robust welfare state in Israel. And so it just grew and grew over the years. And then they did try to codify it into law in a way that it said, well, you're not just exempt by being ultra-Orthodox, you're only exempt if you truly are in yeshiva all day long. This was about 25 years ago when they passed this law. It was called the Tal Law. There was like a whole government commission that came after a Supreme Court ruling to decide what to do. But what that ended up doing is that you would create these yeshivas where you would learn very few hours, or maybe you wouldn't even learn at all, but because you were registered at the yeshiva, you didn't have to go to the army. And then you can't work on the books because you're registered as working yeshiva. It created it just made everything worse, not only in terms of who's serving in the army or not, but also in terms of the employment levels and whether people were getting an education, a secular education or not.
So incentivized people to be on welfare, essentially.
Yeah. So it just sort of blew up to this point where you have like tens of thousands of people every year who could be serving in the army. And I didn't mention this, so to those who don't realize it, other Israelis have a mandatory draft. The exemptions are for Israeli Arabs, and it's not all Israeli Arabs. If you're Druze, you get drafted, and many Bedouins. That also is like a tribal thing in the sense that some Bedouin tribes do it and some don't, and it's like by tradition.
So it's not mandatory for them, but they can serve.
Yes. You know what, I'm not entirely certain whether the army sends letters to them because they know who to send letters to, or whether they volunteer. So that I'm not sure about. But Druze, they do get, they get the letter when they're 17, show up to the army base and take tests so we know where to put you. And then ultra-Orthodox, like Haredim, if they are in yeshiva, then they don't get drafted. But everyone else does. And
so this creates a lot of tension. In addition to the welfare incentive, it creates a lot of tension between the secular and the ultra-Orthodox.
Right. The secular especially, although the Orthodox, who are the non-Haredi Orthodox, also serve at an even higher rate than secular Israelis, actually, because it's considered, the men, because it's considered like a really important value. And we see this in the war now. What's called religious Zionists, which are Orthodox Jews who are not Haredi, they're about 10% of the population, and they've been about 40% of the casualties in this war.
So back to the other question about the government, when you said that there was a party that joined the coalition. So now the coalition is more than 64. Right?
Yeah.
What's the number now?
I think it's 73,
Okay.
but if I'm wrong,
I
Yeah.
just wanted to get a sense of how much
Yeah,
bigger it became.
I think it was.
So in that coalition, if, for example, the ultra-right or the very religious became upset with the direction of the government and they wanted to leave the coalition, would there still be a government?
If you have one party pull out,
Mm-hmm.
then you could still have a government. But if they're all upset about the same thing, then you'd have an election. I don't think it's likely for all of them to get upset about the same thing because they have different emphases.
If one or even two parties pulled out and there was still more than 61, would they still have a government, or do they
In
have to
theory, they would. It's happened. I mean, I can tell you, like, one of my craziest days as a reporter in the Knesset was in 2012. The parties weren't agreeing, and it was over this issue, over Haredi enlistment, and they were going to have an election, and the Knesset was already voting on the law to disperse the Knesset and call an election, and at 2 a.m., a party joins the coalition, and the election was canceled, and then it wasn't, like, the government lasted another 6 months.
without the party that had pulled out or parties that had pulled out?
Right.
That's so interesting.
And it was the second biggest party in the coalition. It was like suddenly instead of like 8 people, you had like 25 people come in. I don't remember the exact numbers. But yeah.
So last question about the structure of it. If these left of center parties had agreed to form a coalition with Likud, do you think Likud would have not formed the coalition with the far right and religious?
So Netanyahu like has become increasingly politically I don't know if yeah, and I was gonna say isolated, even though isolated is not the word, but he's become anathema to everyone who's to his left,
Right.
basically, for a variety of reasons. He has invented this concept of like the bloc, all of these parties that like follow him through fire and water and join him in every coalition, and those are the ultra-Orthodox and the far right. And so we had this period of political sort of instability in Israel where we had 4 elections within a year and a half. And then we had another election a year after that, supposedly stabilized, and the bloc always stuck together. And I think Netanyahu would be very wary, like even if he had the ability, even if the center or the left were willing to join a coalition led by Netanyahu that wasn't in wartime, I think he would be wary of doing it because he feels like the parties to his right are more loyal to him. You know, I didn't mention when I was explaining the process is that generally the prime minister is the head of the largest party in the Knesset, but definitely the head of the largest party in the coalition.
I see. So there can be a largest party in the Knesset that's not part of the coalition.
Yeah.
They didn't form a coalition to get 61.
Yes, which is something that was never tested until 2009 when Netanyahu returned to being prime minister, and he was in the second largest. Likud was the second largest party. The other party, Kadima, I believe, was 2 seats larger than Likud, but Netanyahu was able to form a coalition, and Kadima was not. The Kadima leader was Tzipi Livni at the time.
What does Kadima mean?
Kadima means like forward. Well, if you conjugate it a different way, it could mean progress, but I think they mean like forward. Yeah.
Forward or the Progressive Party.
Yeah, although I wouldn't. They were a centrist party. It doesn't mean progressive the way it does in the West.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, these things don't connect. They don't line up with U.S. politics.
Right. Likud is not an acronym, but it has an alternate name, Machal, which is an acronym, and the the in Machal is liberal. Now, to Americans, like, Likud is not a liberal party, but to Israelis and to Europeans, and I think Canadians, Australians, like liberal means like free market. They believe in the free market.
Interesting.
Yeah.
What is the general trend in like the young people versus, is there a difference in political affiliation?
Yeah, overall, the polling in Israel shows that younger Israelis are more right-wing than older Israelis. And I do think that it has a lot to do with political experience of the different generations. Up until a few years ago, young people in Israel had never seen any kind of peace deal that they could be enthusiastic about. The boomers saw peace with Egypt, and Gen X saw the Oslo Accords as they were sort of coming into themselves politically. And those were times of great optimism for a lot of people. That's not to say that there weren't huge protests on the street and people opposing those things in both cases because of what Israel had to give up for those peace agreements. But millennials sort of came of age politically during the Second Intifada, where there were constant Palestinian suicide attacks against Israelis. Like, I was a teenager at the time. I was living in the US, but I was visiting Israel a lot. I have family here. I was in New York taking the subway, hanging out, and yes, 9/11 had happened, but overall you felt free and safe. And here, like, my teenage cousins would think twice before getting on the bus to go to their friend's house because buses were being blown up. They didn't feel the optimism of the Oslo Accords. They felt that the Oslo Accords and the sort of the aftermath was exploding in their faces. And then that happened again a few years later in the sense that there was the disengagement from Gaza, which is when Israel withdrew entirely from the Gaza Strip. And a year later, Gazans elected Hamas. And then Hamas went out and murdered all of the other parties in the Gaza parliament and started its reign of terror over Gaza and shooting missiles regularly at Israel. So there just like wasn't a lot to be optimistic about, although, you know, the Abraham Accords happened a few years ago, and that's great. But I think that this experience, and it sort of continued because periodically every few years we had these like massive rocket attacks from Gaza happening. Like that's where people's heads were politically in Israel, that you want to protect yourself, that you want to have a strong security state, and that concessions were not working out very well for Israel.
Just briefly, talk about the concessions that were made in the past.
The concessions that did work well for Israel was when Israel conceded the Sinai to Egypt for a peace deal. And that peace deal has held strong since 1979. To say that Egypt is Israel's best friend, it's not. But it has held in terms of there's peace. And the sides talk and get things done when we need to. For a time, like in recent years, relations were actually getting a lot better because of natural gas issues that they were working together on exporting natural gas.
But Israel doesn't have gas.
Israel does. Israel has a lot of natural gas in the sea, which was discovered in around 2010. And Egypt's gas was starting to be depleted. So Egypt and Jordan were buying gas from Israel. And Egypt also had these like facilities to liquefy the gas that Israel didn't have. So they were working together, and that was really good for relations. But that's getting off topic. I don't think that the peace works because Israel conceded the Sinai. I think it works because Egypt really wants it to work. I think ultimately that's what you need, right? But in the Oslo Accords, Israel pulled out of the major Palestinian cities in the West Bank in terms of like having a military presence and control. And the Palestinian Authority was formed, and they governed and still govern the day-to-day of Palestinians. And they had a police force with weapons that was supposed to help Israel in preventing terrorist attacks. And they do to some extent to this day.
The Palestinian Authority has its own police force with weapons in these towns in the West Bank.
Yeah. And for the most part, to this day, the Palestinian police are not the problem. They're really not a problem, and they even often help Israel. And I think, you know, even people who don't want a Palestinian state anywhere will admit that the Palestinian police is not the problem. Yasser Arafat, who was the Palestinian leader, while he was shaking hands with Yitzhak Rabin on the lawn of the White House, was also, on the other hand, commanding terrorist attacks on Israel. Within weeks of that handshake was a bus bombing. You know, the Palestinian bombing a bus in I believe it was Tel Aviv, the first one, after the Oslo Accords were signed. The Oslo Accords were signed in 93. If I remember correctly, it was the end of 93, and then the bus bombing was like January 94 that I'm thinking of. But I'm not entirely sure of all the dates.
And this is called the First Intifada.
No, the First Intifada happened in the 1980s. And to some extent, that was sort of what led the world to say, like, Israel needs to get onto some kind of path for Palestinian statehood because, like, the situation is not sustainable. And that was sort of when there started to be massive pressure on Israel to negotiate with the Palestinians.
The Second Intifada...
The Second Intifada was a lot more deadly than the First Intifada. The First Intifada was a lot more... you can still kill someone by throwing stones and Molotov cocktails and things like that, but that was more of what it was in the 80s. And the end of 2000 is when the Second Intifada started. That was a lot more suicide bombings. But there had been more sporadic suicide bombings through most of the 90s.
So the concessions were land with the Sinai and the West Bank.
Right. So the Oslo Accords, it's interesting because people like to present the Oslo Accords as that Israel agreed to establish a Palestinian state, but it doesn't actually say that. Israel agreed to more like autonomy, right? And to a great extent, the Palestinians in the West Bank have that today. In Gaza, they had it too, which is to say that they're really self-governed in their everyday things. They just can't have an army. You know, Israel is in charge of the sort of surrounding security situation. Yeah. But the massive wave of terrorism that started in the year 2000, let me back up a little bit. So in 2000, Rabin signed the Oslo Accords. He was assassinated by an Israeli extremist.
An Israeli right-wing
Israeli right-wing extremists, right. The Oslo Accords were pretty popular at the time they were signed. By the time Rabin was assassinated, there had been quite a few terrorist attacks. They were sort of less popular, but there was not widespread support for the assassination. Certainly, and to this day not. But Netanyahu was elected prime minister in the next year. And Netanyahu adhered to the Oslo Accords. He didn't reverse them, even though he had opposed them. Because it's an international treaty that Israel had signed, and he felt that it was like the wrong thing to do. He even advanced them, and there were certain things, milestones that were supposed to happen, and he stuck to them. But in any case, he lost the election 3 years later. We have Ehud Barak. There's talks in Camp David, and he makes one of the, I think it's the sort of biggest offer Israel ever made to the Palestinians to withdraw, the most land Israel ever offered to withdraw from, and Arafat said no. And weeks.
And this was what did he offer?
Again, I'm not great with the precise numbers, but it's 90-something% of the West Bank, including dividing up Jerusalem. And I believe it was sort of like international control or something of the old city, like shared control in the old city to some extent. It wasn't just Israel, the old city of Jerusalem. Arafat turned it down, and very soon after, the Second Intifada began. This was in 2000. The excuse that they used was that Ariel Sharon, who was running for prime minister, visited the Temple Mount. Back then, the Temple Mount was like pretty open to people to just come and visit. It's not like today, where it's like a bunker practically if you're not Muslim.
Explain what the Temple Mount is.
The Temple Mount historically was the site of the two Jewish holy temples in Jerusalem, which of course Christians also believe the holy site, mentioned in the New Testament as well as the Old Testament. Over many years, many different conquerors of Jerusalem, many different structures were built there over the years, including churches. But right now on the Temple Mount, there's what's called the Dome of the Rock, which is that golden dome that people see in pictures of Jerusalem, and right next to it is the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Some Muslims regard it as the third holiest site in Islam. It's essentially the third holiest site in Islam and the holiest site in Judaism are in the same place. Because there's a mosque there, and because there's been a mosque there now for hundreds of years, it's essentially a place where Muslims go to pray and very few Jews go. But from 1967, when Israel won the Six-Day War and was able to access the old city of Jerusalem, including the Western Wall, which is abuts the Temple Mount, which is thousands of Jews go and pray there every day, you could visit the Temple Mount like pretty freely and easily for a long time, and only in the Second Intifada did the place become like really, really difficult to visit, like really, really high security. So in any case, in 2000, Ariel Sharon, running for prime minister, went to visit. The next day, the Second Intifada was launched, so there was this sort of propaganda line that it was because of Sharon, but actually Yasser Arafat's wife and senior figures in the Palestinian Authority later said that like no, it had been planned. They were just like looking for a trigger.
Jews are not actually allowed to pray at the Temple Mount. Is that correct?
It's a dispute. The majority rabbinical opinion is that it's so holy that you shouldn't even go there, that we are not holy enough to be able to go there, but there are a not small minority of rabbis who say that it's fine to go there.
This is by religious law, but I mean by law, by legal law.
Oh, by legal law, you are not supposed to pray there unless you're Muslim, because it offends Muslims.
And this is an Israeli law. Like,
yes.
Is Israelis, Jewish.
It's not like a law that passed a Knesset. It's like the regulation that the police uphold.
Because they gave control of that area to the Islamic Waqf.
Yeah. So the Waqf sort of administers the site. The Waqf is the Jordanian Islamic Trust, actually, which when Israel made peace with Jordan, which happened sort of in conjunction with the Oslo Accords, they basically let Jordan's selected Islamic clerics be the one to run the Temple Mount.
So back to the timeline of concessions and violence. There was the successful concession of the Sinai with Egypt.
Yeah.
Then a sort of semi-successful concession with the West Bank.
Ultimately, I think that the through line is that in order for peace to be successful, the people that Israel is making peace with have to actually accept the fact that Israel exists and is here to stay.
You have to want peace.
And to want peace. You don't have to like Israel. You don't have to be best friends with Israel. Egypt is not best friends with Israel. Jordan is really not best friends with Israel. But they accept that Israel exists and they're not going to make it stop existing. And I think that's the difference between the Palestinians with whom Israel signed a peace treaty and in their school textbooks and in the politicians' speeches to the public, you see that they do not accept the existence of Israel. You know, they do not accept that this is something that's going to exist long term.
In the Palestinian or in Egypt?
In the Palestinian Authority, I doubt that the textbooks in Egypt or in Jordan are super pro-Israel either. At the very least, the political leadership is not like, their policy is not one of, well, we're just going to
annihilation.
Right.
So now fast forward to 2005. Gaza was taken in a war,
Right.
As were other territories, a war that wasn't started by Israel. And Jews had been in Gaza for 2,000 years, roughly, from like the 2nd century BC until about 1929, when they were expelled by the British. Yeah. And so then 1967-ish, Jews started to go back since the
Right.
land had been taken.
And it's worth noting, it's not just Gaza. There are a few other areas in the West Bank also that Jews had a long-standing presence before the 1948 Israeli War of Independence, when they were kicked out. Hebron, also Gush Etzion, which like today is basically suburbs of Jerusalem, but they are settlements technically. And so after 1967, a lot of people wanted to go back. I mean, there were people, alive who had lived there 20 years before, and they wanted to go back and rebuild their homes. Gaza is one of those places. It's not to say that only people who lived there before 1929 in the case of Gaza went back, but that was one of those places, yeah. And there's an ancient synagogue in Gaza, beautiful mosaics and things like that you could see. I mean, we can't because there's a war, but in theory, there's pictures.
If you were allowed to, you were allowed to go.
Yeah.
And who knows if it's, what state it's in now. And you mentioned Hebron, which is a holy site also.
Right.
And it's a holy site for Muslims and for Jews.
Yeah, and Christians.
Christians.
Many holy sites for Jews are just holy sites for Christians because they're biblical sites, right?
So now this has been sort of a rambling, not a very linear interview, but it's so interesting, and everything you talked about, it's like a new question. You said technically a settlement. So first of all, this is a word that has a couple of different meanings, and the fact that we use this word as, we say that something is a settlement, meaning that it is in territory that's disputed. Is that that's
It's interesting because in Hebrew, there's a word for settlement that's sort of used for any kind of new place, build a new town.
Subdivision.
Right. I mean, it just means like any sort of new town, right?
It's a place where people settle. Is what that means.
But in English, of course, it has
colonialist implications.
Right, exactly. When Israel wins the war, the 1948 war, they win really in 1949, it's a very small slice of the land that, whatever, these days you hear that chant from the river to the sea, right? So it was a small part of that. It was like the bottom chunk, the top chunk, and then a narrow sliver of land connecting them along the shoreline, along the sea. The river side of that chunk was occupied by Jordan. In 1967, Egypt was lining its tanks up on the border with Israel, and other Arab armies were preparing to attack. And so Israel struck the Egyptians that were very clearly gearing up for attack. The war began. Within 6 days, Israel won the war, won that chunk of land towards the river, which we know as West Bank, the Golan, which is the north mountain area in the north bordering on Syria, and the Sinai, which, as I mentioned, Israel has since given back to Egypt. But the West Bank specifically was the sort of historic heartland of the land of Israel.
Judea and Samaria.
Right. Judea and Samaria are the biblical names. Judea, which is where Jew comes from. Historic Jewish cities like Bethlehem, Hebron, those now were controlled by Israel. But Israel has never officially annexed that land. So it's not considered sovereign Israel by anyone, including the settlers themselves who live under Israeli law in terms, they pay taxes to Israel and their schools are in the Israeli school system. But technically, if they want to add a new 2 rooms to their house, they don't call the interior minister or whoever to get the building permission. The army technically has to sign off on the position because the governor of that area is still the army, because Israel had never annexed that land. So when we're talking about a settlement, I'm talking about land that Israel never annexed. It gets more complicated when you talk about certain areas of Jerusalem, which people will call East Jerusalem, even though it's not accurate in terms of, parts of it are north, parts of it are south. But okay, we'll call it East Jerusalem for the sake of being understood. And the Golan Heights, which Israel annexed in the 1980s. So they live 100% under normal Israeli law, just like you and I sitting in Tel Aviv are in a place that's under Israeli law. But depending on which government you're talking about internationally, they may view it differently.
So everybody who lives in those areas, whether Jewish or Arab or other, have citizenship rights.
They have the right to become a citizen. In eastern Jerusalem, very few of the Arabs living there have availed themselves of that option, though some have. They identify as Palestinians and they don't want to be Israeli citizens, but they still get, for example, Israel's universal health care, and their schools are Israeli, like paid for by the Israeli Department of Education and things like that. So it's complicated.
They're considered what, legal residents?
Yeah, they're legal residents. It's as if they had a green card, and they can vote in the local elections, but they generally boycott them as well. Like every time there's a local election, there's always a bunch of news stories about like some Arabs running for Jerusalem City Council, and then they never get in because almost nobody in the Arab neighborhoods of Jerusalem votes.
This is also interesting.
Yeah. Oh, and by the way, the population of Jerusalem is roughly 50-50 Jewish and Arab. Like if they voted, it would dramatically change the politics in Jerusalem, but they don't do it.
So back to Gaza.
Yeah.
1967-ish, Jews start to repopulate Gaza. Gaza was not officially annexed, correct?
Correct.
So,
and also to say repopulate, like ultimately 10,000 Jews moved there, and it was like a small strip of land by the sea. It was very small, but yes, there were Jews that moved back to Gaza.
And in 2005, there was an agreement made to unilaterally withdraw with the people of Israel within like this.
Yeah, it was a very complicated political process, which if you ask people on the right, they'll say that it wasn't fair, that they didn't follow the rules. But ultimately, the government decided, and the government had majority support in the Knesset, to withdraw all Israeli civilians and they withdraw from Gaza entirely.
So all of the army presence is withdrawn. I assume there had been an army presence there to protect the people.
Yes.
The Jewish people of Gaza. Then inhabitants and their cemetery.
Correct. But all the structures were left behind. So people could, Palestinians theoretically could come and move in and, start their own farm or greenhouse or whatever there, but they basically didn't do that. The reason that I sort of drilled down on that point of like they weren't like resettling Gaza is because part of the reason that the Israeli government decided it made sense to pull Israelis out and withdraw was that you have like 1.5 million Palestinians living in Gaza at the time. Today there's like 2 million, so I don't know the exact number, but I'm estimating, and 10,000 Israelis. There were terrorist attacks on the civilians, and there were attacks on the soldiers there. Ultimately, people made the argument, like, why are we there? Like, what's the point? Is this really helping our security? Like, what are these people dying for? Like, this is a very clearly vast majority Palestinian area. Today, you see a lot of people on the right saying, well, maybe if we had kept the military there, then Hamas wouldn't have been able to build up its current capabilities. Israelis being present in part of the land protects people in all of Israel, because as long as there's Israeli presence, then less terrorism pops up. I see the merits in that argument. I'm not entirely convinced by it. Let's put it that way.
Other people said that, for example, Dan Shiftan told me that the idea was that once all of the Israelis were out, if they shot even one rocket, then the military response would be so crushing that it just wouldn't happen again. And we would have like international support on the crushing military response to a terrorist rocket out of Gaza. Why did that not happen?
Yeah, so Ariel Sharon promised at the time, like, if there was one rocket shot, like you said, there would be, like, a crushing military response. Ariel Sharon had a stroke 6 months later. Who knows what he would have done? But the person who took his place, Ehud Olmert, didn't do that. Hamas took over, I don't know, a few months, or actually it might have even been
2007.
They won the election in 2006. Maybe it took some time before they started killing everyone else. But I think they won the election, like, really, really close, like the dates were really close to when Sharon had his stroke. Like it was really around the same time. So we really don't know how Sharon would have responded to that. But Olmert wanted to continue further disengagements from the West Bank. That was his plan, to just keep unilaterally withdrawing and let the Palestinians figure it out themselves. He won an election that year on that platform. Israelis were optimistic that this was going to work, but it didn't. I think part of the reason that Olmert maybe didn't come down so hard on Gaza was because of domestic politics, because he was already sort of starting to be... First of all, in 2006, there was a second Lebanon war, and Israelis felt that had not gone so well, and he was taking a lot of heat for that, and there were starting to be corruption allegations against him, which he ultimately went to prison for corruption. So I think that he just didn't have the, like, not just the bandwidth, he felt maybe he didn't have the legitimacy to, then Netanyahu came in, and in 2009 he ran on a platform. His slogan was literally strong against Hamas. And while there were some military operations against Gaza, like, he ultimately went on this, like, appeasement route of thinking that if we pay them off, then they'll have a reason to be quiet. Like, if their quality of life is better, then they're not going to want to attack us because they're not going to want to lose that, which sort of worked for a time, right? Like, you had these sort of several years in which, from 2014 until like 2021, right, there was like no major Gaza operation. There were like little things. At the time, if you were asking Netanyahu about it, he would say, look how well this is going. I mean, Netanyahu presided over the quietest decade in Israel's history. It turned out they were biding their time.
There are municipal elections coming up.
Yeah.
Does that connect at all with the broader elections, or are they very separate?
So the municipal elections and the national elections, they in some ways connect and in some ways don't, right? I think the national elections usually have a lot more to do with national security, and the local elections have a lot more to do with sort of bread and butter things like jobs, education, traffic patterns and parking and things like that. But one thing that shows up in a big way, I think, in both, actually, is religion and state issues. We talked about the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredim. The issue of them enlisting in the IDF or not, that's a national issue. But on the local level, there are things about, like, whether shops are open or there's public transportation on the Sabbath, right?
That's a local issue?
It's often a local issue because the mayor can decide to change things. They have to get approval from the national government, but you have like Haifa, for example, a town that's like, I don't know the exact population proportion, but it's very mixed in terms of Jews and Arabs. They have buses running on Shabbat, right? It's a national issue, but it also plays in locally a lot. And I can tell you in the town where I live, we have no Haredi public schools. And there's like a small but growing like Haredi community, like modern working Haredi. And they're always pushing that they want schools, and the mayor always ignores them because he doesn't want the city to have a big Haredi population. He doesn't want the demographics to change, right? And ultimately, like, I live in a city that I think is like 2/3 secular and then 30% non-Haredi Orthodox, and I think like that's a popular position. Like, I don't think that he's going to lose on that. But these are decisions that mayors end up making.
I saw something about like special ways now for the IDF who are serving to be able to...
Yeah. Oh, so what I was trying to say is in this election, in the middle of a war, it's very different. The election was originally scheduled for October 30th, and I had scheduled all kinds of meetings with people that I wanted to interview for an article to write about, to explain to American Jews who read Jewish Insider the national significance of the local elections. And now I have an article coming out, or probably will be out by the time this video's up, about the municipal elections, and the topic is totally different. And now it's about people who were doing reserve duty in the past few months who are now running in an election, and like, how do you do that when you're in Gaza for 4 months, for example, and then you just get released 2 weeks before you're running for mayor? It's very complicated, and the issues have changed too. I mean, I spoke to someone who's running in Tel Aviv, Asaf Zamir, who was the former consul general in New York. He's running basically for deputy mayor, and he's saying the number one issue that people talk to him about is building safe rooms for schools and preschools in Tel Aviv. Just for example, I live in a city that's a relatively new city that was built in the mid-1990s. All the buildings in the city have safe rooms because starting from the 1990s, all new construction had safe rooms. But Tel Aviv is a city that's over 100 years old, and most of the structures don't have safe rooms. And in this war, especially when in the early months of the war, there were rockets in Tel Aviv every single day, you basically couldn't have school because you couldn't have hundreds of children running to an outdoor bomb shelter every day. And that was not the issue he was running on at the height of the campaign in the summer before the war. It's like a different Israel right now.
One thing that's confusing for American observers of Israeli politics is the amount of time between elections, which we talked about is the November 4 years after the election.
Yeah.
Right? What do you think the likelihood is of this coalition holding? How is it going?
So this is really interesting. When the war began, everyone was like, okay, Netanyahu's toast. Like, he's not going to last. There were people who didn't think he was going to last 6 months, right? We're now more than 4 months into the war. I don't think anybody thinks he's going to be out of office in the next 2 months.
There have been protests now.
There have been protests, right.
Again.
So it is not actually that easy. Even it seems like it's easy to get rid of a prime minister because we constantly have elections, but it is really not that easy to get rid of a prime minister if the prime minister himself doesn't want to call an election. There's different parliamentary tools. You have what's called a vote of no confidence. And actually in Israel, you have them all the time. I know in some other countries with parliamentary systems, if you have a vote of no confidence, it's like a huge deal. In Israel, you have them all the time, but they don't actually do anything unless a majority of the Knesset agrees on an alternate candidate for prime minister. So Israel has them all the time, but normally it's just the opposition is airing its grievances and they don't go anywhere. So there's that, right? You could have a party pull out of the coalition and join up with the opposition parties to put forward a bill to disperse the Knesset and call an election. First of all, they would have to agree on all kinds of things like the date of the election and things like that, but also it has to be in their interest. And I don't think that any of the parties in the current coalition has an interest to leave. The Haredi parties are not going to have it better if there's a centrist or left-wing coalition because they are less likely to be willing to subsidize their schools that don't follow the core curriculum of Israel and therefore don't leave their graduates prepared for employment in the modern economy. They're less likely to be okay with the continued exemption from military service. And those are the things they care the most about. Oh, and of course I was talking about things being closed on the Sabbath. That's also an issue. Like, the more you get to the left, the less tolerance people have for these things that the Haredim want. And polling shows that the centrist parties, not the left, but the centrist parties are really strong right now. So it would be a less favorable coalition for them. And then you have the parties on the far right who the centrist parties don't want to be in a coalition with them. They are not willing to because they view those people as extremists. So even though the most extreme right-wing party in the Knesset is polling better than the seats it has in the Knesset now, and I think like it's natural that some segment of the population is going to feel more extreme to the right after the country has suffered a horrible attack. I think like that's an expected reaction in some segment. So they'll do better in the election, but they're not going to get into the coalition. They're not going to be cabinet ministers again. So I just don't think that anyone in Netanyahu's and Netanyahu himself sees that he's not going to do well in the next election. He's not going to be able to form a coalition probably. So nobody has an incentive to break this apart, and the opposition doesn't have the numbers to force it. So that's where we are. I don't think that this is going to last to the end of 2025, which is legally how long we can wait till the next election. But I think that it could last until the next budget vote, which is the end of this year. I think that that's like a pretty fair prediction that this government will at least last to the end of this year.
And what do you think will break it apart?
Well, I think that the budget vote is like always a really difficult. I mean, you see in the US too, like it's just really hard to pass a budget. And so I think that might be like a fair time for somebody to pull out because they're not getting what they want.
And usually this is how the coalitions fall apart because of the welfare and the service for the
there's all different kinds of things. In the past 15 years, governments ultimately fell apart because Netanyahu, who had been prime minister for the past 15 years, with the exception of a year and a half, just realized that the coalition was not getting along at all and therefore not able to get anything done. And then he said, okay, we need an election so we can form a new coalition and come to new agreements, even though it often ends up being the same people, you know? But
so this sounds extremely crazy to
US
observers who have a very different kind of government. We have our own crazy in our government, but the time between elections is stable.
Right.
But you were telling me before we started that Israel's not even the most unstable parliamentary system.
Yeah, when Israel was going through this whole cycle where we basically had 4 consecutive elections within a year and a half, Belgium at that point was like the world record holder of the most time without having an actual government. This happens in parliamentary systems. Periodically, there are all kinds of proposals on how to change, how to stabilize things. There were some things that were done exactly 10 years ago now. There were some slight changes that people thought would stabilize things and they didn't work. I'm like a bit of a nerd. I like to read all of these different proposals and try to think like what would work, what would make us more stable. But I think you need like a really serious overhaul. Like I think maybe if we had a bicameral system instead of one house of parliament, that might help. And if we had like a regional election system and not just the whole country voting for the same people, that might help. But I don't think there's a lot of political will to make those big changes.
That thing that you just said about the whole country voting on the same people,
that's
how these parties, each party has a roster of people, and depending on the number of votes they get, that's the number of
people in that
from
roster who
party,
get
from
in.
that roster. If you vote in like a primary for your party,
So
or
this is part of the craziness in Israel, that there's no law regulating how a party can choose its list for the Knesset, right? When you go on election day and you pick up that little piece of paper, you're supposed to have known by reading the newspaper or by Googling it or whatever who stands behind that name, in theory, right? You might just know who the leader is and decide, I want to vote for this person because I want him to be prime minister. The information is out there. Some parties, the Likud party, the Labour Party, which is like in its death throes right now, a couple of other less famous parties, they do have primaries. And Likud actually has, the way its roster works is the first 18 seats are like national seats, but then after that they have regional seats. So members living in different regions vote people in from their areas, and that's how you get new blood into the party, which it has its pluses and minuses. I think that it's a positive thing that they have a system through which they get new people in. I think that's important because
what is it, like a lottery for the after 18? I mean,
no, there's an order of slots and they choose it. I don't even know how they choose it, but let's say if you live in the Negev and your guy, whoever is voted in out of all the Likud candidates who live in the Negev who wanted to be in the Knesset for the first time, they'll say get into spot number 21 or something.
But how do they, this is what I'm asking, is how do they determine which spot the Negev takes and which spot some other area takes?
It's just like a committee and Likud, it's like a bunch of people, party poobahs who get together and decide that.
On the priority of the region.
Yeah,
like
and usually the West Bank is bumped really low down because there's a worry that that's where there's going to be extremists, which is really interesting.
There is one like extremist Arab in the Knesset, right?
There are like two Arab blocks, I would call them, in the Knesset. Well, one is like a block of a couple different parties, and then one is just a party that got in on its own. And they occasionally will all run together as one united block, and sometimes they'll split up depending on also their own sort of infighting. So the one party that got in on its own is actually more moderate. It's interesting because they're Islamists. They're a very religious party, but they're politically more moderate. And this is a new development. In the past 5 years, they've become politically more moderate because they believe in greater cooperation with the government of Israel.
But it's not Islamism. So explain to me how they're Islamist, because Islamism, as opposed to like being a practitioner of Islam, at least from my understanding,
is political, right?
It's a political program to create an Islamist caliphate.
So that's part of what was so shocking when the leader of the party started to take a more moderate and coexistence kind of position than they had in the past, because they come out of the like philosophy of like the Muslim Brotherhood. Like that's like their early founders came, that those were the ideas that their earliest founders had. They almost see themselves operating the way Haredi parties do, where they say like, we live in Israel, we want to get budgets and whatever for our schools and for our municipalities, and we want to be able to live our way of life, and we live in this country and we're part of this country. It's really interesting. The other Arab parties, one of the big criticisms that some Israeli Arabs, but a lot of Israeli Jews have had, is that they're very focused on the Palestinian issue, right? They're in the parliament of the state of Israel and they're focused on people who are not in the state of Israel. Now, of course, certain policies of Israel influence the Palestinians a lot, right? But that's not what, 85% of what they're doing in the Knesset is about, and yet they're very, very single-mindedly focused on that issue a lot of the time, right? And so there was this schism, and so sort of like interesting development.
Dual loyalty issue.
I mean, I don't like that phrase.
That's why I said it to be sort of controversial, but
yeah, it's just in the Israeli Arab society, the like trust in political figures and the elections in which you have high levels of participation, right? Aside from Jerusalem, which I had mentioned before, are like the mayors and the municipal elections, because those are the people who are dealing with the Israeli Arabs' everyday lives, who are dealing with infrastructure and schools and things like that. To most Israeli Jews, you care about those issues in the Knesset also. The number one issue is national security usually for Israelis, but you care about those other things too. The Israeli Arab politicians, in their actions in the Knesset, they tend to be extremely focused on the Palestinians. Not exclusively, but extremely. For like 50 years, no Israeli Arab party agreed to be part of a governing coalition because they felt that it would make them complicit with what's going on with the Palestinians. And so they were just like the eternal opposition. What changed in 2021, but you could see the change coming a couple of years before that, but in 2021, this leader of Ra'am, they had come from what's called the Islamic movement in Israel, the Islamists. The leader, Mansour Abbas, he agreed to join a coalition in 2021. And he didn't want to be a cabinet minister, but he wanted to work with the government to focus, specifically crime was a big issue also. Mansour Abbas is his name. And he's, I think, a dentist by profession, some kind of doctor. You find this also in Israeli Arab society specifically, like leaders in many, many areas, not specifically medicine, tend to be doctors. So like one of probably the most famous Arab Knesset member in Israel, who's one of these people who's very focused on the Palestinian issue, his name's Ahmed Tibi. He's an obstetrician. I guess like culturally, like if you're very educated, you become a doctor. That's like how they view it in Israeli Arab society. In any case, Mansour Abbas is a dentist, and he is the head of this party. The crime in Israeli Arab towns in the past decade or so has gotten really, really out of control. There's a lot of like theft of weapons and a lot of shootings and things like that. And he decided that whatever they were doing before wasn't working. Let's try working with the government now. And that was a big change in the domestic politics of Israeli Arabs.
And has that helped? Has that done anything to alleviate the crime?
No. Also, that government only lasted a year and a half. Not because of him. I mean, there were some uncomfortable, sort of uneasy things about him being in that coalition, things he didn't agree with, etc. But it wasn't because of him that it fell apart.
Just to close out the interview, what is the one thing that people in America don't understand about Israel that they need to understand?
Oh man, there's so much. I think a lot of American Jews are like, why are Israelis so different from us in many ways? And I, as someone who...
Let's say diaspora Jews.
Diaspora Jews, yeah. Although I think diaspora Jews who don't live in America tend to have like a much stronger connection to Israel in terms of like having family here and visiting here a lot. When you are the minority in America, and as much as people who are not Jewish don't like to recognize that about Jews, I think that most Jews, certainly millennials and older, do feel like they're a minority to some extent. It affects you psychologically in a certain way, the way you look at the world. Certainly millennials and younger, like they don't have any understanding of that or feel a connection to that. They just view the world and their place in the world like very, very differently. People like to look at like, oh, Israelis, they're like tough and they're like rude and they're like this. And I think it's just like more of like a mentality of like, we don't have to like apologize or hide. And not to say that all American Jews are apologetic or hiding, but it's just like a very different, you're coming from a different place.
Yeah.
Although I don't know if that's a good answer to this. I just think that this explains a lot.
It does.
The differences.
It explains a lot because there is a sense, I think, in the U.S. in particular, that there's just been a long history of just keep your head down and don't make waves, you know?
Right. The founding like ethos of Israel is sort of like, well, we're sick of having to keep our heads down. And that's why we need to have our own country where we can just be ourselves.
I mean, the last question is for non-Jews, and especially because this is a Quillette podcast which comes out of Australia, not just specifically for Americans, but for non-Jews outside of Israel.
Yeah.
What's the most important thing to understand, or the top couple of important things to understand about Israel right now in this moment that's just not, that you're frustrated that people just don't get?
This is related actually to my previous answer. Sometimes when you see like polls or like surveys or like man on the street kind of things, and you ask people like point to Israel on a map, and they'll choose some sort of like huge country that's close to Israel. They'll choose like Saudi Arabia or like Turkey or Egypt, and they don't understand that like when you look at this map of the world, Israel is like this tiny country.
The size of New Jersey.
Right, it's the size of New Jersey. I don't even know what to compare it to in Australia, but it's like a tiny fraction of the size of Australia. So they're like, well, what's the big deal? Just give this little bit to the Palestinians, just give that. And it's like, these are all like issues of survival for Israel. And it's not that easy to just give up. And the threats are constant. You either see the war happening or you'll see like, I don't know, like Gal Gadot in Wonder Woman and whatever. And they just seem like normal Western people that people don't understand that like, no, actually we live here. We'll go about our normal lives that look a lot like Western lives, but then suddenly there'll be a terrorist attack, or rocket attacks happening, 45 minutes from the biggest city. Because we live with that, we realize that it's just not that easy. It's just not like you sign a piece of paper and we're done and we're going to have peace. It's a reality that few people in the West, I think, are really able to wrap their heads around. Even if they say, like, intellectually that they understand it, I think the responses often show that they've not quite internalized that no, Israel is, despite being having a strong army, Israel is really fighting for its survival a lot of the time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.